Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Let's make some earrings. On today's installment of making fashion wearables in Grasshopper, I wanted to cover an earring specifically, but more generally, a design style that I've been working on for a little bit and want to share with you all. So let's get into this. We're going to make a piece of jewelry that looks somewhat close to this earring that I had printed out a couple days ago. And we're going to walk through the process of modeling this. And in the next video, probably we'll walk through the process of printing that, setting it up to print on a DLP resin machine. So let's go ahead and get started with modeling this. So to start, let's draw some curves around the ear that we can use to rough out the overall silhouette of this earring. To do that, we're going to need to be able to draw on the ear geometry. Right now I'm using the ear input from the Peacock jewelry plugin for Grasshopper. So that's where I got this from. We can right click and bake this into the scene. So now we have the actual mesh that we can draw on with a curve. So it's important here that we have OSnap turned on. That'll allow us to place points on the vertexes of this mesh. So we'll start by grabbing a curve here. I like to use this curve interpolate points tool, and that'll give us a really nice curve in the scene. So let's grab that tool and we'll start by drawing the curves. So this earring is more of a cuff that wraps around the ear and holds on without needing any piercings or anything. So I'm going to start drawing on the inside here, and we'll just come around the outside of the ear to make this this curve. So that's a good rough start. Now that we have that, we really don't need this mesh anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and we have the base of this curve here. I found from modeling these cuffs that we can get pretty close on the pinch point here, and that'll wrap around the ear pretty well and hold on pretty strongly. So let's modify these point positions a little bit and make it just a smoother curve. One thing we can also do here is if we want to move these points a little bit differently right now, we can come down to this gumball button, and if we right click on it, we can change the positioning of the gumball so we can align it to the actual object itself. And this will allow us to move the points kind of based on their normal position, you could say, on the curve. So now we have the blue z-axis going towards the twist of the curve instead of just being the traditional up and down z-axis. So this might help us move the curve a little bit easier, just relatively to itself. So once we have this first curve, that's pretty good. And then in order to rough out the shape of this curve, we're going to do a tween between multiple curves, and that'll just give us a lot of copies of curves within a certain distance. So we're going to use a component from Pufferfish to do this, and that's going to be the tween through curves command. So we can see what this one requires, and the first thing here is going to be a set of curves to tween through. So we know we're going to need multiple curves to tween through. So if we bring the curve component here, just getting ready, this is how it's going to be wired up. But right now we only have this single curve. So we know we need more than one curve, so we can go ahead and start to duplicate this. I'm just holding down Alt on the keyboard, and we can grab this curve, and while holding Alt, that'll duplicate it. So now we have a second curve, and we can do something different this time. You'll notice if I click on the curve, the points come up and we can select those and move them. We could also click on the curve and come to the toolbar here, and we can just show the curve edit points, and that'll always keep them enabled, which could be helpful, just depending on how you want to work. Okay, so it's going to be best, at least for this style, to keep these start and end points pretty close to the original position, which looks like it's about somewhere right here. Okay, cool. So now we can model the rest kind of however we want. So I'm just going to pull this and bring them to some new positions. Looks pretty good. And then the way I'm working here, it's I've been working with 4 curves. You can tween between however many curves you want, but 4 could be a kind of a good number to get good detail on this. So I'm going to duplicate this 2 more times. Okay, so I'm going to right click this to turn the points off, and then we'll come click this one and turn the points back on. And now I only have the points accessible for this one curve. So it just makes selecting it a little bit easier. So I'll move these around. Maybe something like that. And we'll do the same thing for the third curve here. We'll turn those points on. And now if I drag a box, it's only selecting the points for this one curve, which make things nice and simple. Okay, so now that we have these 4 curves, we can add them all to the curve input here. So it's going to be best to start with no curves selected, so just nothing selected, and we'll come to the curve component and right click and set multiple curves. And now it's important the order you do this in, we want to make it either clockwise or counterclockwise, but we want to go kind of in a circle. So I'll show what I mean here. I'm going to start on the inside, so number 1. And then I'll come down and select this one as number 2. You can see we're kind of going around this way. So 3 and then 4. I'll hit enter on that. And this will start to do the tween, but it's only got 1 curve in the set now, which we want to have as many as needed, so we can change that number. And that's going to be done in the factor here. So right now it's only at 0.5, which is just putting a curve in the middle of the entire set. So if we were to get a range and a slider here, we can plug those 2 together and we can plug that into the factor. And now we'll get a few more points, but we only have 1 on the step here. So if we bring this up, now we have a lot more curves being positioned between these 4 base curves. So a couple more things on that. Right now the slider has 10. If we look at the range here, it's giving 11 values, which is also giving 11 curves. So if you want the slider to equal the number that comes out at the end, we can just subtract by 1 between here and here, and that'll compensate for this this misalignment in numbers. So the easiest way I like to do it is to right click on the input here, just go to expression, and we can write an expression here to do the subtract 1 for us. So we can just do x minus 1. So if we do that, then we can see now we have 10 curves coming out, which is perfect. So another couple options here, we have normalized and equalized. These aren't too necessary to change, but the one good thing to look at would be to change the loop back here. And if we right click on that and set that to true, this is just, if you imagine we have a loft, and we're just wrapping back around to that first curve. So if I don't select these, and we had 1, 2, 3, 4, it would make curves between 1 and 4, but it wouldn't make any curves between 4 back to 1. But if we enable loop back, it'll go all the way around and finish where it started, which is going to be nice if we want a continuous set of curves. Okay, so now we have 10 curves. Maybe I'll do 12. And let's begin to visualize this in 3D. So one thing I like to use is this mesh pipe component. This one here, which is coming from the, let's see. If we do Control Alt and click on a component, we can see what plugin it's coming from. So it looks like this one's coming from Ngon. And this component's much lighter than the traditional pipe component, which could get really, really heavy if you have a lot of curves or a lot of high detail curves. So this one's a lot lighter and quicker to run. The one caveat with this is it's not going to show like interpolated curves too well. It's going to be really faceted. And that's just part of the process of keeping this component super light. But one thing we can do is we could actually make a higher quality polyline because the mesh pipe is converting it to polyline anyway. So if we made a higher detail polyline, then we could see more detail in the pipe itself. So we can use a component called curve to polyline. And we can plug this into curve. And then I like to change the angle tolerance to get a higher detail curve, because we can see right now it's pretty low detail in this white. But if we make this 0.4, then it's going to be a much higher detail line. And if we plug that into the mesh pipe, we get a much higher detail pipe. We could even go lower. We could go to 0.2. That'll be even. You can see it's matching the curvature much better here. Okay, cool. So we can add a radius to this as well. So we can set a custom radius for everything, make it as thick as we want. Let's try like 0.8. So this will start to visualize the actual solidity of the 3D model and show us a solid shape that's not just curves, because that could be a little misleading sometimes if all we're looking at is curves when we know we're going to 3D print this in the future. So we can start to edit the shape, overall shape here. And try to get something that we more enjoy, that looks good as a silhouette. Yeah, so I'd say this one's pretty good right now. I might drop this a little bit. Cool. So now what I'm going to show is some of the custom components that I've been writing to add some more detail to this pattern, so it's not just these tweened curves. So let's grab that component and come back. Okay, so now we have what I've been calling the sinew engine, and this is just going to add a lot more tiny curves that kind of connect between the larger bones of this design, much like sinew would between ligaments and bone or different muscle fibers. We're trying to create with this all those different fibers. So I can describe this more in a separate video because there's a lot going on inside this, but to show just for this workflow for creating this earring, we can just show how it's set up and how it works. So what it needs is a curve input, very basically. So if we plug that in, it's going to give us these sinuous curves that connect the larger bodies together. And if we look at some of the controls here, I mean, it looks pretty good already, but let's see how we can affect this. So if we change the first thing here, which is the search density, we can have a lot more points. The smaller we make this, you can see it's super dense now. Or if we go really high, we get barely any. So let's go back to a happy medium around 3. Okay, if we change the search radius here, the higher we go, it's only going to give us the longer connections. So now we have really long connections from these really disparate points, connecting those together. And the second one here, this negative radius, goes hand in hand with the search radius. So if we go really low, basically what this is doing is subtracting the search radius. So it's now showing us curves that are 17.5 to around 16.5 if this was just at 1. So this is showing, okay, it's only showing curves between 16.5 and 17.5. If we make this really big, it's going to show big and small curves. So now we're almost at 17. So now we're seeing every curve that has a length of 17.5 and like all the way down to every curve that has a length of about 1. So we've got really tiny curves in here and also really long curves. So now we have like everything because 17 minus 16 is about 1. So we're seeing those two different ranges there. But let's bring this back down to something that plays a little bit nicer with the pattern that we have. Maybe something around there, but it's, again, hard to see if it's not in 3D as well. So let's come back and use the mesh pipe component again. So you can see on the output here, we have the bones and the sinew is all these new curves. The bones are just going to be what we were using before. So these are the original tween curves. So if we duplicate this section, we can now see the bones and the sinew separately. And maybe with the sinew, we want to have a smaller radius. And now we can see it in 3D a little bit better. So let's keep fleshing out these sliders here. So the last couple things to look at are going to be the coal too close, and it might be easier to see this without these turned on. Okay. So let's just see these in white again. So this is going to get rid of any curves that are really close together. So if you had a lot stacked up in the same area, this would get rid of those. If we go super big, it's going to start getting rid of everything. So we'll kind of keep this small for now, but you can see if it's at the lowest at 1, there's, a heavy density kind of right here. If we make this a little bit bigger, then it's going to start getting rid and kind of evening out the density overall. And then the last one here, this start and end, this is going to be the actual curvature of these sinew curves. So if this was super low, they're going to be pretty much just lines from point to point, super straight. And then if we make these big, then we're going to have a lot more curvature to that. And the higher you go, the more curvy it's going to get, to the point where it might be even getting curvier than the initial bone curve itself. Now, yeah, see, these are going outside and wrapping back in. So a little bit stringy, a little bit messy, super high. So it's good to keep it at a happy medium again. Come back somewhere around here. Looks pretty good. Okay, cool. So instead of black, let's see this in a better preview color. So I'm just going to grab a custom preview and a swatch here. And we'll see these in a little bit of a better color. It looks pretty nice. And we can start to control these a little bit more. Maybe I want some more curves in these sections. So I need some longer curves there. Maybe we'll get some of the small ones as well. And then maybe we'll just search less. Yeah, there we go. And on top of that, we could change the culling, so we don't get too many on top of each other there. And maybe it'd be nice to have some even smaller ones like in these sections. So I'll raise this up. I'll bring back some of the smaller curves. And maybe we'll search a little bit more just to get those. There we go. Now we're getting some small ones in here. And overall, it still looks pretty good. Let's see, we're getting kind of a shelf falling off here. So I wonder what happens if I change this a little bit. And one thing we could even do is we could experiment with equalizing these curves so they're just spaced out a little bit more evenly. And that gives us another curve here, which is kind of nice. But again, now the silhouette's pretty symmetrical, which maybe isn't great. One thing we could do is experiment with this internal curve. Let's bring that down a little bit. Yeah, now it kind of fits around the ear a bit better. Just changing these points a bit to get it to wrap around the ear a tiny bit better. Again, this part's just mostly up to you, whatever you feel looks best. I'm just showing kind of the process in Grasshopper of how to make this pattern. But yeah, that sits pretty well now. Okay, so let's go back over here. And if this is in a spot that's looking good to you, we can do the last step here, which is just use Dendro to solidify this and make this all good and well for 3D printing. And really high quality for resin printing as well. So anytime we're working with Dendro, we always start with the settings. We're going to plug in our voxel size here. So I always go 0.01 to 1. If you want a better description of what this is all doing, I've covered it in videos in the past. I have a whole Dendro video going over this. But I use some settings here, like 3 and 0, and that just gives us really high detail for the jewelry work. Okay, so now that we have the settings built out, we'll grab this component called curve to volume. We'll plug the settings in. We'll need 2 of them for the bones, another one for the sinew. And these are pretty much the same as what these 2 are doing, so we could even use the same radius. So we have a 1-to-1 of the preview versus the final product. So again, we'll plug the bones up here and the sinew into the one below, just like we did on these 2. And now we kind of have everything we need to start creating this watertight mesh in Dendro. So we're getting an error here just saying that the voxel size is too big to actually show anything. So that makes sense. So we'll just lower this until these come into play. So now they're working with us. Okay, so let's turn this off so we now just see what we're doing in Dendro here. So we have these 2 curves. Let's union them together to give us 1 volume. Make sure we're getting 1. It's good. And now comes the fun part of how we can kind of stylize the connections between the sinew and the bones. So right now, the sinew has this curve built into it that we can see, but when we actually look at the volume around it, it's kind of smooth in the connection between the 2, but it's not the smoothest it could be. I mean, it's pretty sharp in this, coming in at like a almost 90-degree angle. In my opinion, I think it'd be nicer if it had a really gradual swoop in between all the different curve connections, just to kind of, not show that it's just made up of super simple curves, but it has a bit more intentionality to how the curves are connecting. So in order to do that, we can definitely apply a smooth volume somewhere in this workflow. But before we get to that, let's start with the offset volume. And this is one kind of trick I like to do to get these connections to be more gradual and subtle and smooth and pretty and all that. So I'll start by adding a slider here to control how much our offset distance is. So we can run the volume in there. Right now it's offsetting nothing. If we make this bigger, you can see in Rhino how the offset's changing. So basically what we're doing here is the more we offset, the more that kind of these disparate points can connect. So now this section of the curve and this section of the curve are now one, and they're meeting at this portion. So what that allows us to do is we can start to smooth with pretty aggressive values to get that really nice connection between the curves, but without losing the curve itself. So I'll show what I mean. So with the smooth, one thing we always like to change is the iterations here. So we always start at 1, but let's have the ability to go up to 10. We'll plug that in. And we can look at the type as well. So right now, by default, it's always at number 2, which is going to be this mean smoothing, as we can see. But Sometimes I like to play with the Gaussian smoothing, so let's just set up a slider for this. Right now it's at 2, so I'll put that at 2. But I want to play with Gaussian, so we'll go down to 0. And we can see 0 equals Gaussian. So that's just more of a overall, like, super smooth value. So let's see what happens if we don't use this offset. So we'll turn this off. And we'll turn this one off too, so we just see this final preview. Okay, so now you can see with these settings, these sinew curves are completely gone. They've just left behind these little pointy nubs where they used to be, but we've kind of smoothed so much at this point that the sinew curves are just non-existent because of how skinny they were. So I want to keep the skinniness of the curves, and I want them to be super smooth with everything else, but I don't want them to disappear. So what we can do to mitigate this is actually offset them. So now they're super thick, so there's no chance of them, going away into nothingness. But now that also allows us to smooth at a pretty aggressive value. So we can bring that up, and now we can see these connections are super smooth, very gradual, really good curvature there. But now everything is super thick, and we don't want the jewelry to always have to be thick. That would be not good. So what we can do actually is we can have another offset volume over here with the exact same offset distance, but this time let's right click here, go to the expression. I'm just going to flip this 180. So instead of a positive growth, we're going to do a negative growth. So I'll just do negative X and apply that. So whatever our distance was here, we're going out by 1. Now this is going to pull it back by 1. So we've gone up, it's super thick, but it's smooth now, so that looks nice. And what this one's going to do is it's going to bring that distance back down. So now it has that skinniness again. So our curves are now the original thickness, but since we offset so much, now we have a really nice curvature between everything. So let's dial this in, make sure all the curves are where we want them. We maybe could even take up this number a little bit for the sinew curves. That looks pretty good. And maybe let's even make the bones a bit thicker too, so we have a visual difference between the bones and the sinew. So now we have a thick section and a skinnier section. So we've got like 2 levels of detail there, which is nice to see. And then just the last part here, we'll have to convert this volume back to a mesh if we want to export this to print it at all, which we do. So we've got the dendro volume, we'll plug that into here. This will take the volume, convert to a mesh, but we need settings plugged in here, and we can just use the original settings component, plug that in. So now everything has the same settings, which is good practice as well for design. Okay, cool. So now we have one solid watertight mesh. A few things to notice here though is this connection between the ear is now one whole curve, which would be impossible to wear as a cuff if you wanted to continue with the, you don't have to pierce your ear to wear this. So I believe, as we can see here, the sinew is overlapping this section, causing it to make a complete 360. And let's just preview this a little bit. And we can see, yeah, we're bridging the gap here. So now this is a closed circle, which is not great for a cuff. If we look at sinew, yeah, it's these curves here in the sinew that are causing this issue. So one thing we can do is we can cull index. You could also bake this and just delete them and then internalize the curves back in, but let's keep this all procedural. So we'll cull index and let's grab the sinew curves. How many curves are there? There's 116. So let's make a slider here from 0 to 115. So that has all 116 values in it. And let's see, let's preview this and just start scrolling through and we'll see when we hit it. So it looks like, okay, we got one of them there, which is number 4. Let's duplicate this, add it in again, try to find the next one. Okay, I just saw a flash. Okay, there we go, number 1. Okay, so it's 4 and 1. Do this again, looks like there's still another one left. And it is number 2. Okay, cool. So we found the 3 curves that seem to be making up our issue there, which are index 1, 2, and 4. So if we take this now, and we'll plug that in to the Dendro workflow instead of the original sinew list. So when this updates, let's see, let's come through here. It's looking like, I'll show the end result, what's happening here. Let's just preview this ear off so it's not getting in our way. I did notice something here. This line became dotted, which will be important in a minute. But let's just look at what happened. So it looks like the connection's kind of still there, which is maybe just the bones are a little bit too close, which is not a big deal. We can just turn these points on, and let's just move these away a little bit and see what that looks like. Now, since I moved these points, the sinew will update every time you change, but it looks like it didn't mess with our index here. There's no curves bridging the gap. It is getting kind of close though, but that's just because of the offset volume here is connecting a tiny bit. So let's maybe move these as well, just away a tiny bit. Make that offset not connect. Okay, perfect. Cool, yeah, that's looking a lot better there. Let's turn these points off. So let's come back to this, and if we get up close now, we can see that we have a bone curve here, which is going to be these ones, the bones, and then the sinew, so everything around it, these points. But we can see that we have this like intersection of the gray meshes. There's this one inside this other one, which is a direct result of this dotted line here. So when we updated it, for some reason, in the transition between the curve to volume and the union, it put the two different volumes on different branches. So now we're operating with this portion on two separate branches. We want the branches to be together because we want to do all this smoothing on everything at once, so we get that really nice gradient curve transition between all the curves. So what we can do is just come here, right click on the input, and just flatten that. And what that's going to do is put them all back together in one list, and now we get this really smooth curve transition here. So it's looking a lot better. Just a simple fix there. Now we have no more dotted lines, which is good. Everything is now being operated on together. So let's look at the overall object here. It's looking pretty nice. Let's just grab our custom preview, and we'll duplicate that, bring it over, delete these lines, add this one in, and now we can see it in any color of our choosing. The rendering is a lot better with this custom preview as well. So yeah, it looks pretty good. We have a gap here for the ear to fit in between, and hopefully that holds on tight enough so it doesn't just fall off your ear. And yeah, everything else looks pretty good on that. One thing I like to do as well for, maybe you'll come back and I come back and I edit these curves a lot to make different earrings and pieces of jewelry. And it would be really good for every time we update a position of these curves for it not to take the few seconds every single time we want to make a small change to update the dendro section, because this is kind of heavy. Just, we have this one's taking about a second. These are taking, 0.6 of a second to operate every single time. And if you had a lot more curves, this could be, it could get up to super high values, like 20 seconds to load this one component. And that would just take way too long to visualize if you're just prototyping different curve positions. So we have these mesh pipes that, this one's taking 11 milliseconds. This one is so quick it's not even reading. These are always super light, and you can prototype and change curves on the fly, and this will update immediately without having to wait. And that's really nice. So it'd be cool if there was a way to select between these kind of two different workflows. So we have the really fast but really bad detail workflow, and then we have the really good detail workflow with Dendro, but it just takes a while to update. So if there was a way to switch between the two, so we could go from prototype mode to like final render mode, that'd be really nice. So in order to do that, let's grab a toggle here, and this will allow us to toggle between if we want to do the prototype mode or the actual render mode. So let's just rename this just to render ? So basically this is just giving a 0 or 1 value, like a false or true value if we double click it. So that'll allow us to select between two different things. So we can write this into the script by doing a stream filter. And with this, it has a gate. This is the input gate. So right now it's at 0. But let's plug the toggle in. So you can see now with this, if it's 0, we have an output gate of 0. If we change to true, we have an output gate of 1. So whatever is in 1 will now be output. If we change it, whatever is 0 will be output. So this is pretty handy. This is looking like a really good option for solving this problem we have. So let's drag this over. This is the prototype section. So we want this to only render, or to only view when we're not rendering in render mode. So it's set to false. So if everything is in 0 here, and I'm just holding Control Shift to do that movement, that'll show everything only in 0. So that's great for when it is false. So let's work on the Dendro section down here to make it only visualize when we want to do the final render. So we can come to the preview again, and we can say, okay, we want to render, let's go to 1, and that'll, when it's rendered, it'll be 1, and that'll pass through to the 1. So right now, since we're in the not render mode, it's not going to pass through anything. But we still haven't solved the issue of these components taking a while to operate, because they're still going to run even if we make updates. You know, we've just cut it off at the very end here so it doesn't visualize. But let's actually cut off it from the source. So when we don't want it to render, it's not going to take all this time. And the easiest way to do that is just to disconnect it from its settings. So we can see with this part here, if we were to disable the settings, all this goes dark. So all this turns off. So the idea is, if we can enable and disable the settings component at will, we can shut off or turn on all these components. So a really easy way to do that is just to put this in between the settings and everything else. So I'll hold Control Shift on the keyboard again. I can drag everything out, put it into the stream filter, and then let's plug this into 1 here. So only when we hit true will all of this turn on. So let's do that. Let's zoom out so we can see everything. We'll double click on the toggle. So now it's set to true, and you can see in a few seconds here, okay, all this turns on, and the preview for the prototype section turns off. So that's perfect. So let's come here. I'm just going to make this a group, make it a circle. So now it's really easy to see from far away. You know, this is the button we need to press. So let's see. Right now, looks good as render. If we want a prototype, say change some curves around quickly, go to false, and then cool. We're back to here. And now if you want to do an update, you know, I can move this and it's going to be immediately responsive. You see everything updates. So that's really nice. And then once we're happy with how we have everything set, just click it again, go back to the render mode, and we'll see it in super high detail. Now all the connections look nice. We have really good detail there. So that's awesome. So yeah, that should be everything we need. We've got the final mesh here. And let's just bump the quality up even more. So we could put this down. The lower we go, the higher quality we get. Let's go to 0.2. See what the quality looks like when we do that. So it's going to take even longer to render now, because we have so many more voxels to think about. But you can see that now the detail close-up is a lot smoother. From far away, we can't even see the facet subtle anymore. You could go even lower, but the lower you go, just keep in mind, the more you'll have to update these values. So the lower we go, the more distance we might have to offset, and the more smoothing iterations we might have to do to get the same look as when the value was really high but lower detail. So the more detail, the more steps you have to do. So it might even be worth putting this up one more iteration step, so we smooth it 3 times instead of 2. And then yeah, it gives us a tiny bit of a smoother curve. Just a little nice to have at the end there. But yeah, with that, the piece is looking really good. Let's bring the ear back in place so we can see that. Perfect. So now we can see it's wrapping around all the way. Yeah, it looks like it should fit. So let's bake this out. And this is the last step here. So we'll bake that. We get it as a mesh. And now we actually have the final mesh in Rhino. And we can bake this out as an STL to 3D print later. So that's where I'm going to end this video. That's the final step for this workflow. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully make some cool jewelry and 3D print it. If you do, tag me on Instagram, show me, be fun to see. But yeah, if you want this workflow, you want to download this Grasshopper file, that's going to be on Patreon. So I've got a link in the description. Go check the Patreon page. And if you want to just open this file up and start playing with it, you can just grab that and do that from there. It makes working much faster just to have this file. So yeah, that's gonna be it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're enjoying life and designing a lot of cool things. But until next time, see ya.